Well, good afternoon and welcome to Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers' first series of our three-part series on the drought impact affecting the state of Texas. Whether you were in a drought or you've recently got rains or you're still in a drought, the reality is that most of those in the state of Texas have been affected by the drought. And TSCRA hopes to bring you some valuable education and information over the next 3 weeks on how we can assess and manage the risk at hand, look at our land management, look at our cattle management, and hopefully provide some valuable resources for each of you. As I mentioned, this is a three-part series. And so we'll be following up with the next 2 Wednesdays. This coming Wednesday, October 5th. We'll be talking about managing the most valuable resource, which is land. And that will be led by the folks at the King Ranch Institute and those who head up the King Ranch, giving some tangible examples of what they do on the King Ranch to mitigate and manage their land resource and stocking rates. And then the following Wednesday, which will be the third part of our drought impact series, which is Wednesday, October 12th, we'll be talking about dollars and cents for buying and selling over the next 5 years. The folks at Consolidated Beef Producers, Casey Bradshaw and Chad Brown, will be on October 12th to speak about managing financial risk over the course of the next weeks, but years as well. For those of you who are new to TSCRA or may not be a member, this is an open webinar, and TSCRA does offer monthly and sometimes weekly education to our members. And so if you're interested, if you're not a member, we'd encourage you to go to tscra.org/join for more information to get educational material like this monthly, if not weekly, at events and online near you. We'll begin with our speaker, Dr. Justin Benavides, shortly. As you have questions as we go along, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A or chat box below. On the bottom part of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A and also a button that says chat. Please feel free to drop your questions in there. We'll ask those when we get to the end of the presentation, towards the end of the hour, and we'll certainly make sure that most of your questions get answered here live today. And if not, we'll follow up with an email, make sure we get all of your questions answered when it comes to assessing and managing risk this drought. Dr. Justin Benavides is a district economist for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. He's based out of Amarillo and will headline our first series here. He received his bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in agricultural economics from Texas A&M. Justin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak to everyone that's online, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit about what we're seeing in the marketplace, and then some risk management options that I think are probably kind of new to some of our producers that are not in the western half of the state. So we're gonna, as the slide says, we're gonna assess some of the risks that are out there in the marketplace and some of the opportunities. We're in a very unique market setting right now for the cattle market, as well as the beef market. And we want to understand how to manage those opportunities and mitigate some of the risks so that in this unique time where there are profits available in the marketplace, we don't miss out on them. I do want to start out by giving us a little bit of a roadmap. So we're going to talk about the beef markets and the cattle supply and the cattle market. So a lot of times when we think about the beef and beef market and the cattle market, we think about those things as a homogeneous unit, and they are very related. Things that happen in one market certainly influence things that happen in the other market, but the cattle market and the beef market are two separate entities. They are very related, and usually they're correlated, but we certainly want to look at what's going on in each of them independently. So we'll focus a little bit on that. Then we're going to talk about the drought and some of the market dynamics that the drought has created, and some of the opportunities that the drought has created. We're going to talk about some production strategies to manage risk. So a lot of things that we can do right now with our livestock in terms of adding value. We want to make sure that when we take those calves to the marketplace, or when we cull a cow, that we are making the most profitable decision possible. And we want to be able to be flexible and be creative and think about ways that we can make money in kind of a unique again, marketplace, but also physical environment. Again, we're very dry conditions through a lot of the state, as well as, the western half of the country. So we definitely want to use all of our resources to their highest value, and that's going to involve some creativity this year. I will say on kind of that idea of the environment and your locale, Texas is a big state. As Emily said, I'm in Amarillo, so we're in the far northwestern corner of the state. If I say anything today that maybe contradicts one of your local experts, and you have a relationship with your local AgriLife faculty or your TSCRA professionals, and they tell you something that is more tailored to your environment, your production environment, certainly listen to them and engage with them on those kinds of production decisions. Animal husbandry and taking good care of your livestock is the number one thing. I do want to make sure I harp on that. I focus on economics, but we certainly want to take into account our unique environments across the state. Texas is basically 12 different states lumped together, and maybe even more. So if I say something that seems a little off to you based on where you are, certainly engage with some of your other professionals or people that you trust in your area to make sure that I didn't provide you with information that is correct in the western half of the state, but may need a little bit of adjustment on the eastern half of the state. And then finally, we're going to look at some risk management tools and policies that are out there available from the federal government. Not only risk management policies, but some disaster assistance tools. So some things that can help us mitigate some of those losses induced by the drought. And what I've found is that as I've spoken to people in the eastern half of the state, y'all have been fortunate in a lot of cases to not have to use some of these tools. A lot of them are relatively new. And if you've been in a county that hasn't suffered from the severity of drought that we're seeing this year in the last 10 years, some of these tools actually might be new to you. So we just want to introduce them, kind of give you a conceptual overview of what they are used for and how you can find them. And then, I'll take questions there at the end if you need some more detailed information. But that's where we're going to go today. Got about 45 minutes of speaking, and then I'll take questions here at the end. So first, starting off with the beef market. This is a consumer price index for meats on its own. So we want to start on that demand side. Anytime you're thinking about a marketplace and how prices are set, we've got demand on one end and then we've got supply on the other end. And those two things come together to create a price, right? So if you've got demand increasing faster than supply, you're going to have an increase in price. The opposite is true of that. If you've got a supply that's increasing faster than demand, then you're going to have a lower price. And so you can have, demand going up, and at the same time, as supply is going up faster, you're still going to see lowering prices. But we're in a very unique situation right now where demand for beef products is going up very quickly. And we'll show you a demand index for beef only. But even though beef demand is going up, some of our other protein choices are going up even faster. And so if you look here at the consumer price index over the last 5 years in the red line, 2021 in the dotted blue line, and then the current year, 2022, is in that solid blue line. What you'll see there is all meats, so their price index value when compared to the base. And so we can see that obviously prices are higher in 2022. I think we're all aware of that than they were in the previous year and the previous 5 years. You look over here, I've made some notes. Beef and veal is up 3.4% from July to July. So I've missed the August values in there. Right now we're looking July to July. But beef and veal prices are up. Uncooked ground beef is up even higher. So we're going to talk a little bit about cull cows here throughout the presentation. I want you to think about that particular component as we talk about cull cows later on. Ground beef, the price of ground beef is going up faster than the price of some of our more traditionally valuable cuts. But if you look down there at the bottom, then some of our other species, so poultry in particular, is going up much faster in terms of price per pound than is any beef product. And so what we're seeing is a lot of switching in and out, right? So if we think about a different kind of protein, whether that be a steak versus a hamburger or a steak versus a chicken breast, we largely view the protein serving in the United States as the center of the plate, right? So we think about having a steak with sides. You ever notice how you go and the serving is a protein, but then you get whatever sides are mixed in. They don't tell you you're going to get a baked potato and then one of these proteins on the side. So we think about all these as a center of the plate. Now, the steak is the highest per pound value in terms of the traditional center of the plate serving. We can start thinking about a hamburger as a center of the plate serving, right? So we've got the hamburger and then maybe fries or maybe a salad. Then we can also think about the chicken breast or maybe even the pork chop as their center of the plate serving. And so these are all of our substitutes. And as the price of beef and veal went up incredibly fast in the first half of this year, people started moving out of beef and into either less expensive beef cuts, so that's our ground beef, or into our poultry products. And so now we're seeing the prices of those goods begin to rise. So as beef and veal, people are exiting that marketplace and moving into the ground beef and chicken marketplace. The demand for those is going up, and so the price of those is going up very quickly. What I will point out, though, is all of this combined, thinking about the amount of beef consumed relative to price, the amount of poultry consumed relative to price, and the amount of pork relative to price, beef has outperformed the other two proteins by a mile. So even considering the increased prices, people have remained in beef at a much higher rate than they have deviated out to chicken and to pork. And so that's a really strong signal for demand. And that's not only domestic consumption, that's also some of our exports, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But in general, what you need to know, all meat prices are going up. And even though beef and veal prices are currently going up at a slower rate than the other proteins, they are still high, and people are preferring to stay in the beef product when they have that opportunity. So all of that combined, we put together quantity consumed, and we put together the price, add those two things together, multiply those two things together, and we come up with a demand index. So this is the retail all fresh beef demand index, and you can see the base value was set in 2000. Everything from then on is compared to 2000. And so beef demand kind of lagged as we made it through the first half of the 2000s, and it kind of stayed flat into the middle of the 2010s. But then we saw a real spike. Now, some of this is a function of the herd cycle, so increases and decreases in the herd size. And you can see that cyclical movement if you look at this graph, and if we looked at a graph of total cattle inventory. But in reality, what we see is before even COVID-19 took off in 2020, beef demand was getting strong. I mean, it was relatively strong when we compare it to the previous decade and a half. And then we get into COVID-19 and we get into the subsequent years, and beef demand has grown and continues to stay very strong. There is a high demand for beef. And a lot of this is the function of people have a really good eating experience every time they get a beef product. You think about the beef quality audits in the mid-2000s, those reviews that we were having poor consumer experiences. Well, all of you out there in the field really listened to that. We changed our genetic makeup. We changed a lot of our animal husbandry practices, and we produce a really high quality product. And so people are getting a lot more value out of their eating experience for the same amount of money that they spent, or they can spend more money and get a lot more of the same kind of product that they were looking at historically. And so that's really driven up demand for beef. And let's be honest, I mean, if we're sitting there and we're seeing that chicken's going up faster in price than beef is, how many people are going to choose to deviate to chicken when beef is going up, but chicken's going up faster, right? So we've got a preference for beef. It's very apparent in the marketplace, and it's got some staying power. So all of this is really good for the demand side of the equation. So as we've got that price action pulling, we see that we're going to start having some upward movement in calf prices, simply because this half of the equation on its own is saying that we want more beef in the marketplace. So that's good on its own. The demand side is sending positive signals back to calf prices. Now, if we look going forward, there's some deviations again in the kind of products that we're serving. So we want to think back to calf versus cull cow, right? We've got different cuts that are primarily coming out of those different types of animals. So this is the beef primal rib value. And I've got, again, anytime you see one of these charts from me, the red line is the 5-year historic average. The dotted blue line is 21. And then the blue line is going to be 22. We can see that these middle meats have kind of flattened out compared to last year. So they have stayed lower than our values last year. A lot of this is because of that inflation that we're seeing, right? So it's not just inflation in food products. We're obviously dealing with inflation across the board. All fuel, all inputs, a bunch of durable goods, all very expensive. And so again, people are starting to think about, well, I still want beef, but maybe I want to deviate to a different kind of beef product. And so we're moving out of the middle meats. And so that's sending our price signals back down for the middle meats. Still decent prices, higher than the 5-year average, but lower than last year. We look at wholesale boneless beef prices. So that's, again, thinking about a lot of our ground products, things like hamburger helper, things that people can make easily at home a little bit more rather than just going out and getting a meal away from home. We see that it has remained at the same level as last year and hasn't seen that dip that some of our middle primals have seen. And so this is where we're seeing some of that cull cow value come from. People are moving out of some of the cuts that come from our fed calves, moving into some of the products that come out of our beef cows. And that's what's lifting up a lot of this cull cow market at the moment. We'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end, but in general, the boneless beef prices, so our cheaper cuts, staying priced even with last year, simply as a function of consumer spending power, while some of our other primals are staying flatter towards the decreasing side because people have less money to spend on the same meal. You want to think about it. If you've got, $10 to spend at dinner, that's probably not even a steak dinner, but it might be a hamburger. And if you're thinking about feeding a family of 4, it can add up really quickly, and those discrepancies can really multiply fast. And so people are deviating to cheaper cuts. So now we want to start talking about the supply side, right? The demand for those product mixes. We picked up on a demand inherent for cull cows and a demand for all beef products, which is really good for prices across the board. What does our supply side look like? So this is calf prices and cattle inventory, so all U.S. cattle inventory. And then I'm also going to show some drought figures for Texas here in a second. But for right now, I'll focus on this chart. The red bars are cattle inventory, so that January 1 cattle inventory report. And then the blue line is the calf price for Western Kansas for steers on the 5 to 6 weight size. You can see that they are inversely correlated. I know there's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about, influence in the marketplace on prices. And I'm not saying that there may not be some market power exerted to a small degree on the order of a few cents per pound. But I show this chart to show that you cannot beat supply and demand over the long term, right? We see that whenever we've got high cattle inventory here in 96, we've got some of the lowest prices we've seen in history. When we've got the lowest inventory we've seen in history, we've got peak prices. Again, there are times whenever there's leverage on one side of the market and they're going to influence some of the price wherever that part of the market has the power. But in general, I show you this to show that the main driver of calf prices is the supply of calves in the pipeline. And so what does that mean for us going forward? Well, the last time that we really saw a culling on the order that we're seeing right now was obviously the drought in the first half of the 2010s. We saw that we got record high calf prices during that period, largely as a function of the pace of change, right? So usually we've got gradual declines and gradual increases in the calf herd and the cow herd over time as a function of profitability on its own. So we've got too many calves in the marketplace, prices go down, people cull cows. Eventually we get back to a point where we don't have enough cows generating calves, and we send the signal through price back to the ranch to say we need more cows and calves. That's pretty gradual. We see these really incredible spikes in price when the rate of culling and the rate of loss in the cattle herd is fast as well, right? So we think about a pretty stable processing capacity in the United States. And if one part of this equation is moving really fast, so if we're losing a lot of cattle, the other side of that equation has to move fast as well to catch up and balance out demand. If they're moving gradually, they move gradually together. If they're moving fast, they move fast together, but in opposing directions at all times, right? Fewer cows, fewer supply, higher prices. So that's where we were in the first half of the 2010s. Now looking forward, 2021 and into 2022, we are seeing the same setup, but in kind of a different part of the cattle cycle. So again, we're culling. We were already close to some of the lowest cattle inventories we're pushing up against, again, very low cattle inventories over the next year or the next 2 years. And so that is going to, we expect, induce incredibly high prices again, the second half of this year, which we're already seeing, and moving into the next 2, if not 3 years. One way to think about the way that drought influences the cattle herd, and it's different from normal profitability signals. If we have, 33 million beef cows in the United States, and in a normal just profitability culling cycle, we lose 1 million head. In a drought, maybe let's just say, for example, we lose 2 million head. What that's done is it's eliminated 1 million kind of profitable slots that we could have left in if we had the forage to do so. And so that was 1 million productive animals. And in order to get us back to kind of a stasis or a very baseline level of cows back to normal prices, we've got to refill the cows we lost. Well, when we lose them because of drought, we have to retain heifers, which is gonna eliminate another set of beef animals, right? So we got to hold back extra heifers once it starts raining. Those heifers have to age up to where they can be bred. Then they have to be bred, which let's add 30 to 60 days there, and then 283 days until a calf is born, and then 18 to 24 months before that calf is available for beef. So what a drought does is it really begins to send longer term high prices than a normal culling cycle. And so we could look at this particular price movement as a 3 to 4 year extended period of increased prices above where we are now, simply because a lot of this is drought-induced changes. And it's going to take us a long time to build the herd back, even after it begins to rain. This is the evidence that we were seeing out of the drought. The total cattle inventory from that July report was down 2% when we compared to the previous July. We look at cattle slaughter. So beef cow slaughter is up year over year. In fact, all cattle slaughter, all cow slaughter is up, but dairy cow slaughter has remained roughly the same, and in some weeks is actually lower than last year. And so a lot of increased activity in beef cow slaughter, and that's some of that confusing market signaling was that if we're slaughtering more cows, we would expect prices to go down because we've got a higher supply. But the reality is the demand for the products that come out of our beef cows is so high, it's pulling up their values. Again, we'll talk about that here towards the end, but we're looking at a lower number of beef cows. And the only way to make up for lost beef cows is with heifers. But what we saw in the July inventory is that heifer numbers were also down about 3%. So we're culling the productive engine, and over time, what that means is we're going to have fewer calves available for market at the end of this year and into the next year or two. We're already beginning to see that impact prices. So this is medium and large number one feeder steers for the Southern Plains, which is kind of the greater Southern Plains, including Texas. We're seeing prices for those 7 and 8 weight feeder calves already approaching $2. And in some cases up here on the high plains, we've seen 7 and 8 weight calves go above $2 a pound. And so this is beginning to move calf prices very quickly. We expect those prices to remain high over the next few years as that demand pull begins to pull more calves through the system really fast. If you look at cattle on feed, we're placing lighter weight cattle simply because we don't have any pasture, but we're also marketing lighter weight cattle because we don't have enough cattle in the system for them to stay on feed a long time. So slaughter weights are actually kind of trending downward slightly. We're moving cattle through the system quicker, and we expect that in October, we're probably going to have the first cattle on feed numbers that are below the previous year that we've had in quite a while. So that's a signal for calf prices to go higher simply on the supply side. Looking at slaughter steer prices, we've got an inflection point here where we're beginning to see them move upward from that mid-July period. We expect slaughter steer prices to go up. This is going to increase that derived demand for the cows and for the calves coming out of the cow-calf sector. As slaughter steers go higher, feeders have an incentive to buy more feeder calves. They have to pay more for them to compete for them. And so that induces some higher prices for the cow-calf sector. We expect to see that continue to get higher over the next 2, if not 3 years. I think we'll probably, I'm happy to send these slides out to anybody who would like to see them. This is an early part of the year forecast from David Anderson, who's our statewide livestock marketing economist. So he focuses on price forecasting for beef cattle. I've got his forecast here on the left-hand column. So we've got 2020 all the way out to the fourth quarter of 23 for 3 different sizes of calves. And then I've got the feeder contract and the live contract, what their average prices are as of roughly a week ago. I will tell you, every time I have changed this slide for the feeder and live contracts, those prices have gone up. So for the Q4 of 22, when I first made this slide, we were looking at prices in the neighborhood of about $1.65. We've gained about 18 cents in about a 9-month period. And I believe that that's going to continue, where we see prices go up as a function of, again, less supply. When we start thinking about these forces together, beef demand is very high, supply of cattle is shrinking. Again, we expect to see probably some record-breaking calf prices in the next year, if not 2 or 3. So knowing all of that, we've got good demand, we've got shrinking supply. Let's talk about what's causing the shrinking supply and some of the difficulties with adapting that shrinking supply. You know, if we've got high prices, we would hope that we could hold on to as many cows and calves as possible so that we can increase our revenue. The problem being, obviously, a lot of us are lacking forage. And some of the reason we have high prices is that we're losing a lot of cows to drought. So I've got the most recent drought monitor map here on the left-hand side for the United States and for Texas on the right-hand side. I will say both of these maps actually look better than they looked a month ago. If you looked a month ago, or particularly a month and a half ago at this point, most of the Western US and all of Texas was in a much worse state of drought. Now, this is an approximate tool, right? So this is not necessarily accurate down to the square mile, and you very well may be still suffering from some drought conditions. And of course, our friends down around Abilene and south of Lubbock are still seeing some pretty dry conditions, but in general, the conditions are improving for the statewide average. Thinking about that, we are still short on forage across the state. So we've got some struggles in deciding what to do in terms of getting the most we can out of these high prices we expect to come. So thinking about where we are and where we're going in terms of the weather outlook, this is the seasonal temperature outlook from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The darker red, it doesn't mean that it's going to be hotter. It means it's got a higher probability of above average temperature. Now, you can think about that being sort of a proxy for us seeing hotter temperatures, but the way to interpret this the right way is to say we've got above average chances of above average temperatures for the next October, November through December. So you can look at this gradient scale down here, and it shows us that for about 2/3 of Texas, we've got roughly a 50 to 60% chance of above average temperatures, or what they say is likely above. We're likely to have above average temperatures. That changes a bit when we get into the January, February, March quarters. So things begin to cool a little bit relative to the quarter we're in right now. Things get a little bit cooler. The parts of the state that remain warm are smaller, though there are still some warmer parts of the state. But then when we get out to April, May, and June, we begin to see some of those temperatures that are warmer than average, and a greater chance of warmer temperatures than average taking back over. So the outlook for the next 9 months is for a greater than average chance of above average temperatures. So if you need one word for that, it's going to be warmer than average. Now looking at precipitation, you kind of get the opposite signals, right? So you look at this, the darker brown, the greater the chance of below average precipitation. So for the bulk of the state, for the final quarter of 2022, below average precipitation. First quarter of next year, we see that same pattern, but now it's in precipitation rather than in temperature. So average precipitation for the bulk of the state, but there about a quarter of us are going to see still below average precipitation. Then we get out to that next quarter, so April, May, and June, and we begin to see some better outlook for precipitation. So that April, May, June quarter, we've got a likely above or leaning above forecast for above average precipitation for about 2/3 of the state. So that's really good news. And even if we stick with average precipitation here in the Panhandle during that period of the year, that's when we get the bulk of our moisture. So this is actually a positive map. This is the 1 out of 6 that is positive, but the takeaway that I want you to think about for our next 6 months again is lower precipitation, so drier than average. And again, we think back to those temperature maps, warmer than average, right? So drought conditions to stay in place through probably at least March. We think about that because we want to think about what we want to do over the winter. So a couple of different production options. We're thinking about calves on one side of our herd and cows on the other side. We're going to talk about a bunch of different really brief things we can do in order to get the most value out of our land, right? Because our productive asset, first and foremost, is our land. And then we use livestock to kind of mine the productivity and kind of take the value off the land in a recurring cycle, so then we can market that value to someone else. So the two ways we do that typically want a cow-calf operation, or we can cull cows or we can sell calves. And so the difficult part with drought is that most people, whenever we have a business, we think about business in terms of profit maximization. The struggle here is that drought puts us in more of a cost minimization standpoint, which is not as much fun as maximizing profits, right? Because we've got to think about, well, instead of growing my business, I need to make sure that I am not shrinking. And that's just never as fun. So we can look at drought as increasing our expenses and probably shrinking our revenues because we just can't support as much on the same land. It's probably a mix of those two. Depending on the way that you manage through drought, you could just have a lot greater expenses, keep the same number of cows and calves, or you could cut a lot, cut your expenses, but then you're obviously shrinking your revenue quite a bit. So let's just think about some marketing options for calves right now that we could look at given where the marketplace is. We could do our weaned calf sale. So again, now I'm thinking about market values for here on the High Plains. If you've got different stuff around the auctions where you're selling, or if you're marketing somewhere in Oklahoma or Louisiana or New Mexico, you might see slightly different numbers, but in general, I think the trends and the answers here are going to hold roughly the same. We've got our fall weaned calf sale. About a week ago, we were seeing roughly $2.05 a pound for those 4.5 weights. That generates about $922 in revenue. That's our traditional model, particularly in a normal cow-calf part of the state. We sell those weaned calves, get rid of them, and move back into having just cows so that we've got appropriate forage supply for the demand that we need from our total herd. An alternative this year, given that calf prices are going up, is that you could think about overwintering stockers in lieu of a weaned calf sale. Now, I know I just said we don't have a lot of grass. So what does overwintering stockers probably mean? If you want to do that, you're probably going to need to think about some excess culling for your cows, for the beef cows, right? If you're overwintering stockers, there are some animal husbandry things I'd encourage you to think about. If you've never dealt with stockers before, certainly talk to an animal science professional or someone you trust who has marketed stockers before, because this is not just placing calves out on pasture and then taking them to the sale a little bit later. There are things that you need to do to add value to those calves, and we'll talk about that later, but it does involve some more management than just dumping them out on pasture and leaving them there for a longer period. We do have a deficit forage across the state, so think about what adds the most value. If you can cull cows and make some good revenue and have a good reserve of forage for your productive cows in the spring, that might be worth thinking about. Or if you typically already cull a lot anyways, and you've got some excess forage in a normal year, you might be able to replace with stockers, but really focus on making sure you're not keeping cows and supplementing them so much that you are squeezing the profits out of what little grass we have this year and going into a negative where we're spending more money than we're making. But if we look at that revenue generated, if we sell that stocker calf in the spring at roughly 7 weight, we're going to get $1.86 based on our forecast values. That's revenue of $1,302. What that means is if you can maintain those calves for about $380 a head or less, then you've made a profitable decision by holding on to those calves. Now, within that cost, you also have to think about did I cull some cows? Did I have to supplement some cows additionally to keep them because I'm using too much forage? You definitely have to factor in additional cow costs as part of this $380 a head if you're keeping the same stocking rate of cows and then trying to maintain stockers as well. That's going to be very difficult to make profitably. Stockers make their money on sorting out those difficult calves into a good homogeneous unit and also being on cheap forage at the same time. So it's really going to be tough to keep the same amount of cows and do stockers. But if you've got some flexibility, this is something worth thinking about. Again, you want to make sure you can do it for kind of under these values that we're showing here. You could also think about retaining ownership through the feed yard there again. That's that sale of a fed calf in the middle of 23 for roughly $1.55 per pound is what we're forecasting. So that's a revenue generated of 2015 bucks. We think about the estimated cost of gain or our variable cost in this setting. You know, if you've got cash corn priced here in the High Plains at about $7.30 a bushel, and we take into account our normal feed to gain ratio, our cost of gain, along with the yardage fees already embedded is going to be anywhere from $1.10 up to $1.30, just depending on where you're buying your corn at. You could market here those calves using some of the risk management options we're going to talk about later. So all along the way, you're obviously owning these calves for a longer period of time. There's more risk involved. You want to think about mitigating the risk of owning them. We're going to talk about some of those options here towards the end, but here's some creative things for you to do. It's not anything we haven't ever talked about before, but as calf prices, we think about me updating my forecast every time I do this presentation. As those values continue to go up, that means that there's probably some embedded value in the marketplace that you're going to be able to gain if you have these opportunities. That gives us roughly a margin of 42 cents per pound of gain because you know, if fed prices are $1.55 and let's just say we're sticking at that $1.13 cost of gain, that yields us about 42 cents per pound of gain, which is a profitable decision. Another thing to think about if you are going to do stockers or if you're just going to continue with weaned calves, there's a whole bunch of literature here, but the takeaway for this slide is that we want to add management to these calves, right? There's value to your time and some things that you can do to these calves that will make them bring more money at the sale barn. So if you haven't done any of this stuff and you have time before you go to sale, certainly worth thinking about. If you've never done this before, reach out to your AgriLife professionals or to your folks at TSCRA, and they can certainly point you in the right direction or even come out and help you to do some of these management activities to try and get as much money as possible. So let's just think here about the idea of implants. There's a lot of perception out there in the marketplace that if I don't implant my calves, I'm going to get more money at the sale barn. I want to tell you explicitly, you can quote me on this, that if you don't market those calves in an NHTC program and you don't have them verified, and probably if they're not going to be marketed to the European Union, you're taking your calves to sale. They are not being marketed as NHTC and they're just getting the same price as everybody else at the expense of some gained pounds, right? So we've got some figures here of ROIs on those implants. In general, implants are a very profitable decision. And if you're not explicitly making the decisions to manage for an NHTC program, I would highly encourage you to look at implants because it's a very cheap way to add value to your calves. And we want to generate more return per unit of grass that we're having these guys graze, right? Again, we think about our base productive asset as grass. Everything you can pull off of that grass cheaply while still having that base forage available for next year is going to increase your overall profit margin. Other things we can think about, some processing. So right now, here in the Panhandle at least, we were seeing a week ago unweaned calves. I'm sorry, I've got a fly flying around. So if you see me waving my hand, I promise I'm not going crazy. I've just got a fly up here. We've seen unweaned calves selling at a 3 cent to 7 cent per pound discount. So that's roughly $22 a head. We saw bulls selling at a 10 cent per pound to 60 cent per pound discount. So right there, if you're not castrating, you're losing in the neighborhood of 150 bucks per head. That's a lot of money left on the table. And if you're not dehorning, you're probably leaving somewhere in the neighborhood of $13.50 a head on the table. So we think about all these things combined. Let's think about someone who's doing all of these things and adding implants versus someone who's doing none of these things and not implanting. That's probably a swing of anywhere from $150 to $200 a head from some very basic fundamental management strategies that we really need to think about as we have fewer calves to sell, but the calf price is higher. That's going to allow you to generate more revenue on the same number of calves. So now let's think a little bit more creatively about the cow side. This is U.S. net beef imports, anything under the yellow line, or sorry, under the zero line right here. This is, if we are below the zero line, then we are a net exporter. If we're above the zero line, we're a net importer. And so that's monthly values. What you can see here is that for the last few months, we've been a net exporter of beef. And if we were to continue this to July and August, those values would show us being a net exporter as well. What do we export a lot of? A lot of offal, a lot of, a lot of premium cuts. So things we don't eat and high valued cuts. So really generating a lot of value off the fed calves there. What do we import? We import a lot of grind. We import a lot of ground beef, lower value. And so what we're seeing here is a signal that we don't have enough ground beef, right? We don't have enough ground beef in the marketplace, and the value of what we're exporting is really outpacing what we're importing, which is a positive for the whole sector. But in general, some of the export dynamics and the current supply of cull cows is leading us to this really supported cull cow market. Again, if we had a lot of cows being culled and slaughtered, we would expect prices to be lower, but that's not the case this year. And that's simply because people are moving to that kind of ground beef and that kind of lower valued cuts, which come out of our slaughter cows, right? I will say the question I get pretty frequently is it more valuable for me to hold these cows through the winter so that I have something to market in the spring, or so that I can market the calf that cow will have under these high prices? I would tell you that looking just at the idea of, particularly if you've got an open cow, if you've got an open and you think I might manage her through the winter to get to higher prices in the spring, it's not going to pay off. I hesitate to have an across the board assertion like that as an economist, because I'll probably be wrong, but I feel pretty confident in this one, right? We see that prices are going to trend downward through the remainder of the fall. And it takes us till about late February or early March to get back to the prices we're at right now if we follow that seasonal trend. So do you think that you can manage that cow for what's roughly going to maybe be getting us back to even? And even if she goes up, let's say her values get back up to 75 cents in the spring, can you manage her from 65? Can you manage her for 10 cents a pound for the next 6 months? I really doubt it based on the forage situation that we're in. So if you haven't marketed your opens, get rid of them. I know she follows you on the Ranger. I know she's really cute. I know you have a name for her. If you're looking at this in a way to make money, it's time to call those opens, because they're going to be very difficult to make money on ever if they haven't calved or if they came up open this year. If she is bred and you're needing to make some really strategic culling decisions, that gets a bit more complicated, and I don't want to, brush off how difficult it is to get rid of cows. I understand that that's an emotional decision and it's tough. Just looking at it from the dollars and cents side, if you want to have another cute cow 10 years down the road that you can love and adore on the way you loved on this one, you probably need to start making some really critical decisions in this year just to make sure that we've got forage and revenue available for later on. Now, if we start thinking about what we can do with that money, again, let's think about if we've got an open. I want to point out that there's a lot of creativity available in this space right now. If you've got an open, right now what we're seeing, here's some outcomes. Let's say we hold her and sell her in the spring. We don't make any money today. We expect her dollars per head revenue in the spring to be roughly $780. And she's going to, she's going to take up that same, she takes up all the forage that a cull cow would eat. If we color, we're going to roughly generate revenue today of $1,000. And then we have that forage left open. So we don't have to feed the percent of that cull cow value. Also, we could think about looking at our other options, particularly, if she's open and you can go in the marketplace, and these are real values. I've had people tell me there's nothing on the marketplace for me to buy if I cull and I want to replace. That's not the case according to what we're getting in our market reports, right? We've got a bunch of different kinds of pairs or replacements that are available on the marketplace for those people that don't have forage. And from a cull cow value right now, you can just about pay for a replacement pair or a replacement bred, and that has the guarantee of a calf next year. You can still turn around and cull this cow in the spring, right? You can sell her again, and if prices went up, then you can call me and tell me that I was wrong. but I'll tell you, you also get the value out of her calf, right? So if you got opens, it's time to get rid of them. If you've got some that are not great performers and you have the chance to introduce some new genetics, I think what we're seeing is that there's not a whole lot of demand for the pairs and the replacements right now. So you might be losing out on some replacement stock, but marketing them as culls, you're really going to generate enough value that you might be able to use that cash to either take care of your cows that you maintain or get creative and get some short-term profitability here on making some cattle trades, right? Now I want to talk briefly about risk management. I've just about run up against my time. I want to leave time for questions, but let's briefly talk about risk management in the context of a normal production year, but also in drought. We want to identify where our risks are, and where we can identify those risks, make them as small as possible. That's going to increase our total earnings. There's a bunch of different ways that you can manage risk. We talk about two buckets here, production risk, and we talk about price risk management. We'll talk about both of those programs briefly, or programs for both of those briefly. But remember that risk management is not always a net profit. Risk management is designed to give you, for a baseball metaphor, consistent on-base percentage, where not managing risk and not spending money on insurance and a bunch of other programs might get you some home runs in some years, but you're also probably going to completely lose the game in other years. And so it's not always going to make you money, but over time, risk management tools are designed to keep you in consistent positive returns rather than having to potentially, cull a lot more than you were expecting. So if we think about some risk management programs, I'm not going to harp too much on futures and options. I know that our audience has a variety of different sizes. The thing you need to know is that futures and options are a historically valuable tool for those who have the cash flow to manage their futures and options account. I'd encourage you, if you're interested in risk management, to talk to some brokers about opening an account. If you have questions about finding those people, I can certainly help you. But what these contracts allow you to do, if you're not aware, you essentially are going to, in different settings, lock in some prices that are available now. And on a futures contract, you're obligated to that contract. On an option, you have the right but not the obligation to sell at that price. And so I typically prefer options. And again, I've got some brokers who can walk you through the details of this stuff. But in general, what these allow you to do is essentially lock in prices at a given time. With prices going up right now, though, there's probably some other options that we can look at. The other half are another valuable tool in livestock price protection is going to be this relatively newer LRP program. So this is livestock risk protection. This is a subsidized put option. So we think back to the option, it allows you to lock in a price for a small premium. So there is some expense to this program, but it allows you to lock in prices ahead of time. There's a bunch of different contracts available. The good things about LRP is that there's been a lot of adjustments to the program, particularly over the last 2 years, that have made the policy more flexible and more accessible. And so it's become relatively cheaper because the subsidy increased. There's a lot of different contract sizes. You can insure all the way down to a single head. There's some different arrangements you can make to make that coverage tailored better to a dairy calf or a heifer calf, or for those of y'all in the southern part of the state and cattle with ear, they have different tailoring options for different kinds of cattle. I will tell you that economically what we expect is that if you keep consistent coverage over time, we expect that you will earn the subsidy rate. So that's just the way that these programs work. If you keep consistent coverage, you are bound to make money over time simply as a function of the subsidization. A couple of other things we already touched on, right? You can tailor this coverage really well. What I want you to focus on this slide is that you can find daily quotes and the premiums for those contracts at this website. And again, I'll have my information at the end of the presentation and happy to send this stuff to you. But you can find quotes and see how these contracts have performed historically and look at what prices are today. If you have a crop insurance agent in your area that markets livestock risk protection, go ahead and call them and just set up your account with them. It costs you nothing to set up your account. You don't have to make any commitments until you decide to place coverage. And so you can call and have your application ready and get the paperwork started. And then the day you decide you want to make an LRP contract, you can call and they're ready to go. They definitely advise having your contract set up, ready to go ahead of time. Another thing, we're getting more into the production risk management side, is going to be that livestock forage program. So those of you on the eastern half of the state are the ones who I've noticed may not have as much familiarity. This is a drought disaster relief program that compensates for lost grazing production. I'm really sorry. I think this fly is actually trying to, it's trying to ruin my presentation. Make sure y'all don't get this information. Apparently it's bugging me. Disaster relief program that compensates for lost grazing. It's based on different durations and severities of drought. There's a bunch of other animals. So for those of you out there who have species other than cattle, a bunch of different livestock can receive indemnities under this program. But essentially what you get are months lost in grazing, which are kind of defined based on how bad and how long the drought has lasted. They multiply those months by the payment rate you see over here. So let's think about adult cows, about, let's just say roughly $50. These prices are set by USDA. We would then go look at our different forages. This is the native pasture map. So a lot of the state is eligible already for 5 months. What that would mean is that if you're here up in Dallam County and you've got a beef cow, then she is eligible for a $250 payment, because $50 per month multiplied by 5 months. So much of the state is eligible for $250 per cow, or $200 if you see red, and different other rates of payments based on different cattle sizes. But you have until next January 31st to apply for this program. PRF is something that I encourage you to look into. Again, this is, we think about back to those outlook maps for the precipitation. Pasture, rangeland, and forage, or PRF, is that rainfall insurance. So if you've heard of rainfall insurance, we think about west of Abilene, every dollar you invest in PRF, over time, we expect it to pay back $2 to $3. East, it gets a bit more touch and go, but because we have those seasonal outlook maps and they kind of tell you when they expect rainfall to be above average or below average, you can begin to think about when you need this coverage. It looks like there might be parts of the year we don't need PRF next year, right? But if you see that those seasonal outlook maps are showing a drier than average expectation, we can place PRF insurance. What it's going to do is anytime you have below average rainfall according to the index for your grid, it's going to pay you an indemnity. So it's not based on county, it's based on these grids that are 17 miles by 17 miles. You lock in some coverage level, so 1% of your historic rainfall. And if you get below that amount of precipitation, you get an indemnity. And so I definitely encourage you to look into this, particularly knowing that we are going to be seeing drought conditions for the next 6 to 9 months. This program deadline is December the 1st this year. So get in with your crop insurance agents. This one also is marketed through federal crop insurance agents. The one good thing I will mention too about PRF setups and some LRP setups, both, is that both of these products don't really require any premium payments until the contract has expired, or until the terms of the contract have largely been executed. And so they'll give you, you don't have to pay up front. You'll get your net indemnity. And so if you get an indemnity that's larger than your premium, you never have to pay. They give you your check net of the indemnities already. If you don't get an indemnity, you will later on in the contract term have to pay a premium, but you don't have to pay up front. So that's made these a little more accessible as well. A couple of other brief programs. LIP, this is for excess death loss. That's for really kind of acute natural events. NAP is a risk management program for different kinds of grain and forage crops. I'd encourage you to look into. It does require premiums. Annual forage, we're going to think about that in terms of some of those stalker policies if you're in a part of the state that has a lot of wheat grazing. So this is a policy that can help you double up coverage if you both plant wheat and you want your typical crop insurance and you graze calves. You can insure both uses. One thing I want to touch on is ELAP. This is kind of a catch-all program they've added a lot of flexibility into. If you've hauled water this year or hauled hay in excess of what you normally haul, you can get some indemnities out of the ELAP program based on how much you've hauled. So if you haven't gone and visited with your FSA professionals about ELAP, be sure to go visit with them and see if you're eligible for any sort of indemnities based on these drought conditions. So real quick takeaways: really strong beef demand, shrinking cow herd, and that's going to lead us to some increased prices. We expect even potentially record-breaking prices that we haven't seen before. Opportunities in the market, let's think about some flexible ways to market calves. So find ways to add value. If you're not taking some creative management options, then you're probably leaving money on the table. You might also want to think about overwintering stockers or retaining ownership through the feed yard if you have that opportunity. If you don't, and you're really short on forage, then you might be running short on options. But it's time to get creative and think about new ways to do business to make sure that you're squeezing all of the money you can out of the limited forage that we have. The cull cow market is also very strong. And if you've got opens, I would encourage you to find, as my colleague Jason Smith says, find a new career for her. That doesn't necessarily mean that she has to go be beef, but you got to find something new for her to do to generate value. And she may fit someone else's operation better than she fits yours, right? And you can use the revenue generated from the culling in order to make some more profitable decisions for some cows that actually have a calf on the ground already or are already bred. Risk management, here's a list of programs that I'd encourage you to look into. I know I had to touch on them very quickly, but a lot of these are going to help you to mitigate risks so that you can get the most out of your calves by locking in some prices on the price risk management side or on the production side. This suite of programs has really begun to develop a solid, consistent safety net for cow-calf and cattle producers. And I really would encourage you to go look into them to make sure that, again, you're not leaving money on the table. And people say, you know, like some of these disaster programs like ELAP or LFP are free, but they're not. Your taxes paid for these programs, and your taxes paid for the subsidies on PRF and on NAP and on LRP. Your taxes are paying for that. So if you're not going out and using them, someone else is using your tax dollars. So I'd encourage you to think about, again, you've already paid for these programs, and I really think it'd be worth your time to at least consider them to make sure that you're forming that safety net. I really appreciate your time. I know I covered a lot in a short amount of time, but I hope that it's helped you out a little bit thinking about our next 6 to 9 months. This is my information. I'd be happy to take any questions right now, or if you want to find me, you can find me at any of these addresses, that phone number, that email address. I'll let you in on a secret. I don't really give out my cell number, but that phone number forwards directly to my cell. So you can catch me anytime. If you have questions, I'll do my best to answer. And if I don't know the answer, I'll hunt down somebody that does. So please feel free to reach out. And yeah, Emily, I guess I'll take some questions if anyone has any.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for your time, Justin. That was fantastic and lots of really, really great information. I really appreciate you joining us. We do have some questions submitted, and for those of you who are still watching, if you do have questions, I would encourage you to go ahead and drop those in the Q&A or chat box below. But let's go ahead and start getting into a few of these questions. When we're talking about cull cows, Justin, what options do you recommend? What are the best choices, best price for cull cows?
Yeah, so best price is difficult, right? The best price is what do you get at the auctions around you. You certainly don't want to, at a certain point, you don't want to haul a half empty trailer a long way to get better prices because you're going to spend a lot of money on gas. But options in terms of creativity for those cull cows, I would think about what you do with that revenue for her. And so if you're short on forage and you're already culling because you're short on forage, although there are creative opportunities out there like breads and some pears, you're probably better off using some of that revenue generated from a cull cow sale, taking care of the genetics that you held on to, right? So making sure you've got the feed resources and some of that cash reserve to take care of the cows that you maintained. That would be my advice. If you've got enough forage and you're just culling based on profitability, not because you're out of grass, then that's where you can get more creative and you can look at some breads, you look at some pears, take them back to the ranch. And again, you don't have to make a long-term commitment to those cows, right? This is something that you can overwinter her, get her calf on the ground, and still cull her in the spring. This doesn't have to be a genetic commitment to your herd, particularly if she's already bred or has a calf on the ground. And a lot of those are coming available because people are asking the questions y'all are asking. What do I do when I need to get rid of cows, right? So if you can get creative and find a good deal, I'd encourage you to make some swaps and some trades. Run the numbers. Definitely sit down and see what's going to be the best use of your dollar. And I'm happy to help you do that if you don't have the technical skill to sit down with Excel and just check out what your options are. But a couple of different options there. So it's a long way to say it depends.
Great. Another question, a little bit on the consumer side as well. Talk a little bit, if you would, about implants, pros and cons of implanting before you take them to the sale barn, and then programs that they could be in, vice versa. And what does implants look like from the consumer side of things?
Sure. So I want to be careful here and make sure I point out I am an economist. I'm not an animal scientist. So again, if you have an animal science professional who tells you something different on the science side, please listen to them. And also, if you've got really technical questions on implants, I'll connect you to my colleague, Jason Smith, who's our animal science specialist up here. But briefly, the way we look at it financially is that implants are really cheap and they add pounds, right? And so the return on investment for implants is really high. And if you look at the value generated by a beef carcass, pounds are what pay. The grid does add value, but the more pounds you put on these calves, that's what generates the most revenue. And so there's been some perception out there in the marketplace that, feeders aren't as likely to buy implanted calves because they've been implanted already and there's not going to be as much gain for them available. But what the science I've been told shows us is that those aren't necessarily offsetting, that you can get gains in the cow-calf sector and still get gains in the feeder sector by implanting at both stages. And I'll be honest with you, if you're not marketing your calves as an official NHTC program, those calves are getting implanted the second they get to the feed yard anyways. They are. And so if you're not implanting, it's a really cheap way to add some pounds and add some value. If you're interested in programs that allow you to get more value out of NHTC calves, I would again point out you need to get in a certified program, and that's probably going to require some validation and some spot checking and a lot of that kind of stuff. And I'm not an expert in those programs, but pounds are typically what pay. And unless you're marketing just a lot of calves in an NHTC program, the numbers would suggest that you're better off implanting than not. If you have questions on specific programs, please reach out to this address and I'll connect you with the people, particularly Jason Smith, who can help you with specific programs.
Great, thank you. Our next question is about brokers and recommendations for brokers. For anybody in the essence of time, maybe who's looking for some broker recommendations, they might email you or any answer there on that topic from your end.
Please do.
Okay. So Bob, who submitted that question, Justin's email's on the screen. And for those of you who are still watching as well, you can always email education@tsra.org. If you don't have a pen handy, to grab Justin's email now, and we can make sure and get those answered to the best of our ability. Last question that we've got, this is the last question we'll take, and then we'll end it for the day. What do you think, Justin? I know you're not a weather meteorologist, but what's the possibility of drought in the future? What do you think it looks like?
Well, we look at those seasonal, I go by those seasonal outlook maps, right? And they're not perfect, but I'll tell you that in the summer of 21, so June of 21, this was after we had some of those historically high, or maybe it was 2020. No, it was 2020. When we had some historically high rainfalls. We saw the derecho in the Midwest, and we couldn't get it to stop raining in the Panhandle. June of that year, after we'd had some historic rainfalls, those maps were already showing drought conditions taking hold in December. And I was making my decisions and choices and recommendations 6 months in advance. And so they've held true. The magnitude isn't always exactly correct, but I'd encourage you to look at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's seasonal outlook maps. So even if you just Google seasonal outlook maps from NOAA, so that's NOAA, you can find those outlook maps, and they're going to tell you in general what the expectations are from the larger meteorological community. So that'll help you determine kind of what drought conditions may look like in the future.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Thank you for joining us today, Justin, and those of you who are online. Thanks for joining. Again, if you have any questions, you could certainly grab Justin's email or email education@tsra.org. If you're not a Cattle Raisers member, we'd love to have you, tsra.org/join. Thanks for joining today.